My name is Celeste Mitchell. I'm 29 years old, and 3 weeks ago I walked into my parents' 30th wedding anniversary celebration uninvited. The look of pure terror in their eyes when they saw me standing in that doorway was worth every sleepless night I'd spent planning this moment. You see, 6 years ago, my parents told me I was no longer their responsibility the day after my college graduation. What they didn't know was that I'd been secretly recording our conversations for months, documenting their emotional abuse and financial manipulation. The family they'd built their reputation on was about to crumble, and everyone they'd ever lied to was about to learn the truth. Before we dive into this wild family drama that literally changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty and revenge, I want to know, where are you watching from? If you've ever dealt with toxic family members who think they can just erase you from their lives, hit that like button, because this story is going to show you exactly what happens when the abandoned child grows up and fights back. And definitely subscribe, because you won't believe the bombshell evidence I had that completely destroyed their perfect family image. Trust me, the reunion confrontation is just the beginning of how karma finally caught up to them. Growing up in Westchester County, the Mitchell family looked absolutely flawless from the outside. My father, Robert Mitchell, was a successful corporate lawyer who specialized in estate planning for wealthy families. My mother, Patricia, was the quintessential stay-at-home mom who organized charity galas and headed the PTA at every school I attended. They lived in a beautiful colonial house with perfectly manicured gardens, drove luxury cars, and never missed a Sunday service at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. But behind closed doors, our house felt more like a business than a home. Every conversation was transactional. Every achievement was measured against how it would reflect on the family reputation. My parents didn't ask about my day because they cared about my feelings. They asked because they needed to monitor what stories might get back to their social circle. From the time I was 12, I started noticing the cracks in their perfect facade. My mother would spend hours on the phone with her sister, complaining about the financial burden of raising a child while trying to maintain their lifestyle. My father would come home from work and immediately retreat to his home office, emerging only to critique my grades or appearance. They spoke about me in the third person even when I was in the room discussing my college prospects, like I was an investment they were trying to optimize. The emotional neglect was subtle but constant. They never attended my school plays unless other parents would notice their absence. They bought me expensive gifts instead of spending time with me. When I tried to talk about problems at school or with friends, they'd redirect the conversation to how my issues might affect their standing in the community. I learned early that my value to them was entirely dependent on how well I performed the role of perfect daughter. High school was when their true priorities became crystal clear. They hired expensive tutors and insisted I take advanced placement classes, not because they believed in my potential but because they needed me to get into a prestigious university. The college application process became a nightmare of constant pressure and criticism. Nothing I did was ever good enough. My SAT scores could be higher, my essays could be more compelling, my extracurricular activities could be more impressive. When I got accepted to Northwestern University with a partial scholarship, you'd think they'd be proud. Instead, my father immediately started calculating the remaining costs and complaining about how my scholarship wasn't enough. My mother began telling her friends that I'd gotten into several schools, implying that Northwestern was just one of many options, when in reality it was the only school I'd gotten into that they considered acceptable. The summer before college was particularly brutal. They used every family gathering and social event as an opportunity to showcase their successful daughter, who was going to Northwestern. But privately, they were already discussing their post-graduation plans that didn't include supporting me beyond my college years. I overheard conversations about how they could finally travel more once I was settled, and how they were looking forward to getting their lives back. What hurt the most was realizing that they'd never actually seen me as their daughter. I was a project, a reflection of their success, a checkbox on their list of life accomplishments. The moment I graduated and they could claim credit for raising a college graduate, their job would be done. I was about to discover just how literally they meant that. College became my escape, but even there, their control followed me. They monitored my grades obsessively, calling professors when they thought I wasn't performing well enough. They criticized my major choices, my friends, even my part-time job, claiming everything I did reflected on the family name. The financial support came with endless strings attached and constant reminders of how much I was costing them. By my senior year, I could feel them emotionally checking out. Phone calls became shorter and more businesslike. They stopped asking about my future plans beyond graduation. When I brought up potentially living at home for a few months while I job searched, the silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. That's when I knew something terrible was coming and I started preparing for the worst. Graduation day at Northwestern was supposed to be a celebration, but it felt more like a funeral for the relationship I desperately hoped might still exist with my parents. They showed up dressed impeccably, smiling for photos and playing the part of proud parents for the other families around us. My mother wore her favorite navy dress and pearls, the same outfit she wore to important social events. My father had his camera ready, taking pictures that would later appear on their social media with captions about their successful daughter, but I could feel the cold distance in every interaction. Their hugs felt performative, their congratulations hollow. During the ceremony, I watched other families crying tears of joy and pride, while my parents sat stone-faced, checking their phones and whispering to each other about dinner reservations and their flight home the next morning. The dinner that night was excruciating. They chose an expensive restaurant near campus, the kind of place that would impress anyone who saw us there. But our conversation was stilted and awkward, filled with long silences and forced small talk about my professors and the ceremony. When I brought up my job search and asked about potentially staying with them for a few weeks while I found an apartment, my father's expression immediately darkened. "We need to discuss your future living arrangements," he said, his voice taking on the same tone he used with difficult clients. "Your mother and I have been talking, and we think it's important for you to establish independence immediately." I felt my stomach drop, but I tried to stay optimistic. "I understand that, Dad. I'm not asking to move back permanently. I just need a little time to find a job and save up for a security deposit." My mother jumped in, her voice artificially sweet but with an edge of finality. "Celeste, darling, you're 22 years old now. You have a college degree. You're perfectly capable of figuring things out on your own. But where am I supposed to live until I find a job?" I asked, my voice starting to shake. "I don't have enough savings for an apartment, and most places require proof of employment." My father pulled out his phone and started typing, completely disengaging from the conversation. My mother continued with her rehearsed speech about building character and learning responsibility. It was becoming clear that this wasn't a discussion, it was a notification of a decision they'd already made. The next morning, they drove me back to my dorm to collect my remaining belongings. The ride was silent, except for the GPS directions and occasional comments about traffic. When we arrived, they waited in the car while I packed my life into suitcases and boxes. No offer to help, no nostalgic moments walking through the place where I'd spent 4 years growing up. As I loaded the last box into their car, my father finally spoke. "We've transferred $2,000 to your account. That should give you a good start. Your mother and I are confident you'll figure everything out." $2,000, I repeated, unable to hide my shock. "Dad, that's barely enough for 1 month's rent and deposit in most places." "It's more than many people get," he replied coldly. "You're an adult now, Celeste. This is how the real world works." The drive to the bus station, because they weren't even driving me to my destination, was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept waiting for one of them to change their mind, to realize how cruel they were being, to show some sign of parental love or concern. Instead, my mother spent the time on her phone confirming dinner plans with friends for that evening, while my father discussed work calls he needed to make when they got home. At the bus station, they didn't even get out of the car. My father popped the trunk and I struggled to remove my heavy bags while other travelers stared. My mother rolled down her window just long enough to say, "Take care of yourself, dear. We know you'll do fine." As their car pulled away, I stood on the sidewalk with everything I owned piled around me, watching my parents literally drive out of my life without a backward glance. The bus ticket in my hand was for Chicago, where I had a friend from college who'd agreed to let me crash on her couch for a few weeks. I had $2,000, a college degree, and the devastating realization that I was now completely alone in the world. The worst part wasn't even the financial abandonment, it was the emotional coldness of it all. They didn't seem sad or conflicted about cutting me off. They seemed relieved, like they were finally free from a burden they'd been carrying for 22 years. In that moment, standing outside a Greyhound station with my entire life in suitcases, I understood that I had never been their daughter in any meaningful way. I had been a long-term project that had finally reached completion. That night, as my bus pulled away from Evanston and toward an uncertain future in Chicago, I made a promise to myself. Someday, somehow, I would make them face the truth about what they'd done. I would make sure their perfect reputation was built on the honest foundation of who they really were as people and as parents. The first year in Chicago was brutal, but it taught me everything I needed to know about survival and self-reliance. My college friend Sarah let me sleep on her couch for 3 weeks, which gave me enough time to find a tiny studio apartment in a questionable neighborhood and land a job as a server at an upscale restaurant downtown. The work was exhausting, but the tips were good, and I quickly learned that my Northwestern education gave me an advantage when talking to wealthy customers. Within 6 months, I'd saved enough to move to a slightly better apartment and started taking freelance writing jobs in the evenings. My degree in communications and journalism was finally paying off, and I discovered I had a talent for marketing copy and social media content. I spent every free moment building my skills, taking online courses, and networking with small business owners who needed help with their digital presence. The loneliness was overwhelming at times. Holidays were the worst, seeing social media posts of other people with their families, while I spent Christmas alone in my studio apartment eating takeout and trying not to think about the beautiful family dinners my parents were probably hosting for their friends. But that pain fueled my determination. Every rejection, every late night, every dollar I scraped together was building towards something bigger. By my second year in Chicago, I'd built a small but steady client base and was making more from freelancing than from restaurant work. I quit serving and rented a tiny office space with 2 other freelancers. My specialization in social media marketing was perfectly timed. Small businesses were just starting to understand the power of Instagram and Facebook advertising, and I was ahead of the curve. The breakthrough came when I landed a contract with a struggling boutique clothing store. Their sales had been declining for months and they were considering closing. I restructured their entire online presence, created an influencer partnership program, and developed a social media strategy that tripled their online sales within 4 months. Word spread quickly through Chicago's small business community, and suddenly, I had more clients than I could handle. But here's what my parents never understood about me. I wasn't just smart, I was strategic. While I was building my business, I was also quietly investigating theirs. I spent hours researching my father's law firm, tracking down former clients and employees who might have information about his business practices. I monitored my mother's social media accounts and those of her friends, collecting information about their lifestyle and social circle. What I discovered was fascinating and infuriating. My parents had been telling people for years that they were supporting me through college and helping me get established in my career. They posted occasional photos on social media suggesting ongoing contact and relationship. My mother even shared articles about successful parenting strategies and the importance of launching young adults into independence gradually. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it also gave me valuable intelligence. I learned about their social patterns, their friends' families, their business connections, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. My father's law firm had been involved in several questionable estate settlements that had resulted in complaints to the State Bar Association. My mother's charity work involved organizations where significant amounts of money had gone missing, though nothing had been proven. By year 3, my marketing company had grown to 15 employees and was generating seven-figure revenue. I'd moved to a beautiful loft in River North and was being featured in local business publications as one of Chicago's 30 under 30 entrepreneurs. The transformation was complete. I'd gone from abandoned daughter to successful businesswoman, and I'd done it entirely without their help or support. But success wasn't enough. Every achievement felt hollow because the people who should have been proudest of me had no idea what I'd accomplished. Worse, they were probably still telling people they'd raised a successful daughter, taking credit for my achievements while having contributed nothing to them. That's when I started planning my revenge in earnest. I hired a private investigator to dig deeper into my father's business practices and my parents' financial situation. What we discovered was a pattern of ethical violations, tax avoidance strategies that bordered on illegal and financial mismanagement that had left them much less wealthy than they appeared. The investigator also uncovered something that would prove crucial to my plan. My parents had been claiming me as a dependent on their taxes for 2 years after they'd cut me off, collecting significant tax benefits while providing me with no support whatsoever. This wasn't just morally wrong, it was tax fraud, and I had the documentation to prove it. I also learned about their 30th wedding anniversary celebration planned for the following year. It would be a large gathering of family, friends, and business associates, exactly the kind of event where public exposure would cause maximum damage to their reputation. The guest list included judges, other attorneys, wealthy clients, and prominent community members. It was perfect. The final piece of my strategy involved reconnecting with extended family members who had been wondering about my absence from family events for years. I carefully reached out to my cousins, aunts, and uncles, sharing carefully edited versions of my story and gradually revealing what had really happened after my graduation. Their shock and anger at my parents' behavior gave me additional allies and sources of information about family dynamics I'd never fully understood. Now, I need to pause this story here because I can see some of you in the comments already guessing what's coming next, and trust me, you have no idea how deep this goes. If you're loving this journey from abandoned daughter to successful businesswoman planning the ultimate family confrontation, make sure you're subscribed because the reunion scene that's coming up is absolutely explosive. I spent over a year planning every detail of what happened that night, and the evidence I brought with me literally changed the entire family dynamic forever. The look on their faces when they realized I wasn't the helpless girl they'd thrown away was just the beginning. The invitation to my parents' 30th wedding anniversary celebration never came, obviously. But my cousin Marcus, who had become my ally over the past year, made sure I knew every detail about the planned event. The party would be held at the Westchester Country Club, the same venue where they'd celebrated every major milestone of their perfect marriage. 200 guests were invited, including family members I hadn't seen in 6 years, my father's law partners, my mother's charity circle, and prominent members of their church community. According to Marcus, my parents had been telling people for months that I was traveling for work and couldn't attend. They'd even crafted an elaborate story about my international marketing consulting business that required frequent travel to Europe and Asia. The irony was delicious. They were so close to the truth about my success, but they had no idea it was real or that I'd achieved it entirely without them. My preparation for the confrontation was meticulous. I worked with my lawyer to ensure that everything I planned to reveal was legally sound and wouldn't expose me to defamation claims. I organized my evidence into a comprehensive presentation: bank records, showing my financial abandonment tax documents, proving their fraudulent claims, recorded conversations demonstrating their emotional abuse, and a detailed timeline of their lies to family and friends. But the most damaging evidence came from my private investigator's deep dive into my father's law practice. We discovered that he had been systematically overcharging elderly clients for estate planning services, often adding unnecessary complexity to simple wills to justify higher fees. Several families had complained to the State Bar Association, but my father's connections and reputation had protected him from serious investigation. The tax fraud was particularly egregious. Not only had they claimed me as a dependent for 2 years after cutting me off, but they'd also been claiming educational expenses they hadn't paid and charitable donations that were significantly inflated. My accountant estimated they'd avoided paying over $15.0 taxes through these fraudulent claims, which opened them up to criminal prosecution if reported to the IRS. I also discovered that their apparent wealth was largely an illusion. They were carrying massive credit card debt to maintain their lifestyle, had borrowed heavily against their house, and were behind on several loan payments. The country club membership that defined their social status was months overdue, and they'd been juggling payments to maintain the appearance of financial stability. 3 weeks before the anniversary party, I made my final preparations. I booked a suite at the Four Seasons in Westchester for the night of the party, arranged for a car service, and bought a stunning black cocktail dress that cost more than my parents had given me for my entire post-graduation. Survival. I hired a professional photographer to document the evening, ostensibly for family memories, but really to capture evidence of what was about to unfold. The psychological preparation was just as important as the practical details. I practiced my confrontation speech dozens of times, refining the timing and delivery to maximize impact. I studied the guest list and planned exactly who I would approach first, how I would introduce myself to people who hadn't seen me in years, and what information I would reveal to whom. The key was to start subtly and build momentum throughout the evening. I would arrive early during the cocktail hour and begin reconnecting with family members and family friends. I would gradually reveal more details about my post-graduation experience, letting the truth emerge naturally through conversations. By the time my parents realized what was happening, it would be too late to control the narrative. I also prepared for their likely responses. My mother would probably try to minimize and deflect, claiming misunderstandings and emphasizing my sensitivity. My father would likely become angry and defensive, possibly trying to intimidate me into leaving. I practiced staying calm and composed, focusing on facts rather than emotions, and maintaining control of the situation, no matter how they reacted. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep. 6 years of pain, anger, and determination had led to this moment. I reviewed my evidence one final time, confirmed that my phone was fully charged for recording, and mentally rehearsed my opening lines. Tomorrow night, the truth would finally come out, and everyone who had believed in my parents' perfect family image would learn who they really were. I also thought about the potential consequences. This confrontation would permanently destroy any chance of reconciliation with my parents, but that relationship had been dead since the day they drove away from the bus station. It would embarrass and humiliate them in front of their entire social circle, but they had spent years lying about our relationship and taking credit for my achievements. Most importantly, it would free me from the psychological burden of being their dirty secret. For 6 years I had carried the shame of their abandonment, wondering if somehow I deserved what they'd done to me. Tomorrow night I would transfer that shame back to where it belonged and finally be able to move forward with my life, completely free from their influence. The stage was set, the evidence was prepared, and the guest list was confirmed. In less than 24 hours, the Mitchell family's perfect reputation would be in ruins and justice would finally be served. I arrived at the Westchester Country Club at exactly 6:15 p.m., 15 minutes after the cocktail hour began. The timing was deliberate, early enough to blend in with arriving guests, but late enough that people would already be settled with drinks and beginning conversations. I walked through the elegant lobby wearing my black cocktail dress and pearl earrings, looking every inch the successful businesswoman I had become. The first person to recognize me was my Aunt Helen, my mother's younger sister, who nearly dropped her wineglass when she saw me approaching. "Celeste, oh my God, is that really you?" Her shock was genuine and immediate. "Patricia told us you were in Europe for work. When did you get back?" "Actually, Aunt Helen, I've been living in Chicago for 6 years. I run a marketing company there." I smiled warmly, watching her confusion deepen. "I haven't traveled to Europe for work. I'm not sure where Mom got that idea." Before she could respond, I spotted my cousin Marcus across the room and excused myself to say hello. As planned, he introduced me to several family friends who hadn't seen me since high school. "This is my cousin Celeste," he announced. "She's been building an incredible business in Chicago. Tell them about your company, Cel." For the next hour, I worked the room systematically, reintroducing myself to people who thought I'd been traveling the world as a successful consultant. The contrast between my parents' stories and my actual presence created immediate confusion and curiosity. People began asking pointed questions about my work, my travels, and why they hadn't seen me at any family events in recent years. "I've actually been in Chicago the whole time," I explained to my father's law partner. "I haven't traveled internationally for work, and unfortunately I haven't been able to make it to family events because—" I paused meaningfully. "Well, it's complicated. Around 7:30, my parents finally noticed me. I was standing near the bar, surrounded by a small group of their closest friends, when I saw my mother freeze mid-conversation across the room. She grabbed my father's arm and whispered something urgent in his ear. His head snapped up, scanning the crowd until his eyes locked with mine. The color drained from both their faces simultaneously. My father immediately started walking toward me, his jaw set in the aggressive expression I remembered from childhood arguments. My mother followed a few steps behind her, practiced social smile, flickering on and off like a broken light bulb. "Celeste," my father said loudly, interrupting my conversation with Judge Richardson, one of his most important professional contacts. "What a surprise to see you here. I thought you were overseas." The judge looked confused. "Overseas?" She just told me she's been running a business in Chicago for several years. Very impressive operation from what she's described. I watched my mother's face contort as she tried to process this information. "Darling," she said, her voice artificially bright, "you must be confused. We've been supporting Celeste while she builds her international consulting practice. She's been traveling constantly." "Actually, Mom, that's not true." My voice was calm and clear, carrying easily to the growing circle of listeners. "I haven't received any support from you or Dad since graduation day, when you dropped me off at a bus station with $2,000 and told me I was on my own." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Richardson's eyebrows shot up, and I could see several other guests turning to listen to our conversation. My father's face was turning red. Celeste, this isn't the time or place for this discussion. We should talk privately. Actually, Dad, I think this is exactly the time and place. These are your friends and colleagues, right? The people you've been lying to for 6 years about our relationship. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. Would you like me to play the recording of our last conversation where you told me I was no longer your responsibility and that you were done investing in my future? My mother gasped audibly. You recorded us. That's illegal. Actually, it's not, since Illinois is a one-party consent state. And I have hours of recordings documenting years of emotional abuse and manipulation. I looked around the growing crowd of shocked faces. But that's not even the most interesting part. My father tried to grab my arm, but I stepped back smoothly. Don't touch me, Dad. Not unless you want me to call the police and report assault in front of all your colleagues. By now, nearly half the party had gathered around us, including my mother's charity friends, several of my father's law partners, and most of our extended family. The atmosphere was electric with tension and curiosity. Since you've been telling everyone about my success for years, taking credit for raising such an accomplished daughter, I thought you'd want to know the real story. I smiled at the crowd. I did build a successful marketing company in Chicago, but I did it completely alone after my parents abandoned me the day after college graduation. No family support, no financial help, no contact whatsoever. I pulled out a folder of documents I'd prepared. In fact, not only did they provide no support, but they've been claiming me as a dependent on their taxes for years while I've been completely financially independent. They've been collecting tax benefits for a daughter they threw away like garbage. The crowd was stunned into silence. I could see people looking back and forth between my parents and me, trying to reconcile this information with years of stories about their perfect family. My mother started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of humiliation and rage. How dare you come here and embarrass us like this, after everything we did for you, everything you did for me? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean like paying for college while treating me like a burden, like making my graduation day about your reputation instead of my achievement, like abandoning your two-year-old daughter at a bus station because supporting me was inconvenient for your lifestyle. The explosion of my parents' perfect facade was complete, but I wasn't done yet. The real bombshell was still coming. But here's what makes this story even more interesting, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. While I was building my business from nothing, living on ramen noodles and sleeping on couches, my parents were telling everyone about their generous support of my international career. They've been taking credit for my success while having no idea what I'd actually accomplished. I opened my folder and pulled out several documents. These are my tax returns for the past 6 years, showing my actual income progression from server wages to 7-figure business revenue. And these, I held up another set of papers, are my parents' tax returns, which my lawyer subpoenaed after discovering they've been committing tax fraud by claiming me as a dependent. Judge Richardson, who was clearly following every word with professional interest, stepped closer to examine the documents. Are you saying they've been claiming dependency exemptions for someone they haven't supported for 6 years? I confirmed. They've avoided paying over $15 0 taxes by fraudulently claiming educational expenses they didn't pay and a dependent they abandoned. The IRS tends to take tax fraud very seriously, especially when it's systematic and deliberate. My father's face had gone from red to pale gray. Celeste, please, you're misunderstanding the situation. We can discuss this privately and clear up any confusion. The only confusion here is how you convinced yourselves that abandoning your daughter was acceptable parenting. I turned to address the crowd directly. 6 years ago, these people told me I was no longer their responsibility and drove away from a bus station without looking back. Today, they're celebrating their marriage, surrounded by friends who think they're wonderful parents because they've been lying about our relationship for years. My cousin Marcus stepped forward. Celeste, is this really true? Uncle Rob and Aunt Patricia have been saying you were traveling for work. Call my office in Chicago right now, I said, pulling out a business card. Ask them when the last time was that I traveled internationally for work. Ask them how long I've been running the company. Ask them if I've ever mentioned receiving family support for my business. As Marcus dialed the number, I continued my revelation. But the tax fraud isn't even the worst part. My father has been systematically overcharging elderly clients for basic estate planning services, adding unnecessary complexity to simple wills to justify higher fees. Several families have filed complaints with the State Bar Association. One of my father's law partners looked stunned. Robert, is this true? We've talked about those complaints, but you said they were baseless. They are baseless, my father insisted, but his voice was shaky now. This is a vindictive attack from an ungrateful daughter who... What? I interrupted. Who succeeded despite your abandonment, who built something incredible without your help, who refused to let your cruelty destroy her? I looked around the room at all the shocked faces. I'm not ungrateful, Dad. I'm grateful I learned early that I couldn't depend on you. It made me stronger than I ever would have been otherwise. My mother was now sobbing openly, her perfect makeup streaming down her cheeks. This is humiliating, she whispered. How could you do this to us at our anniversary party? How could I do this to you? The audacity was breathtaking. You abandoned your two-year-old daughter and then spent 6 years lying about it to maintain your reputation. You took credit for achievements you had nothing to do with. You committed tax fraud using my information, and you're asking how I could embarrass you. Marcus hung up the phone, his face grim. They confirmed everything. Celeste has been running a successful marketing company in Chicago for over 5 years. She's never mentioned family support, and she hasn't traveled internationally for work in over 2 years. The silence that followed was broken by Judge Richardson clearing his throat. Robert, Patricia, I think you both need to speak with attorneys immediately. And not each other, he added pointedly, given the potential criminal implications of what we've heard tonight. Several guests began pulling out their phones, undoubtedly texting and calling other people about what they'd witnessed. My parents' social circle was tight-knit and gossipy. By tomorrow morning, this story would be all over Westchester County. My father made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Everyone, please. This is clearly a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand. Celeste has always been dramatic, and she's obviously upset about something. I'm not dramatic, Dad. I'm factual. And I'm done carrying the shame of what you did to me. I looked around the room one final time. These people deserve to know the truth about who you really are behind your perfect family facade. As I turned to leave, my mother grabbed my arm. Please, she whispered desperately. We can fix this. We can work things out. You're still our daughter. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back up at her tear-streaked face. No, Patricia. I stopped being your daughter the day you decided I was no longer your responsibility. What I am now is someone you no longer have any power to hurt. I gently removed her hand and walked toward the exit, my head held high. Behind me, I could hear the explosive burst of conversation as the room erupted in shocked discussions about what they'd just witnessed. In the lobby, Marcus caught up with me. Cel, that was... Wow. Are you okay? I'm perfect, I said, and for the first time in 6 years I meant it completely. I'm finally free. The next morning, I woke up in my Four Seasons suite to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The story had spread exactly as I'd expected, and the consequences were swift and severe. My father's law firm suspended him pending investigation. The State Bar Association reopened their inquiry into the client complaints. The IRS received an anonymous tip about potential tax fraud that would trigger a comprehensive audit. But more importantly, I finally had closure. The people who had hurt me most deeply had been exposed for who they really were, and I no longer had to carry the burden of their abandonment in silence. The little girl who had been thrown away at a bus station was gone, replaced by a woman who had built her own empire and fought back when necessary. That experience taught me that sometimes justice doesn't come naturally, sometimes you have to create it yourself. Family loyalty should be earned through love and support, not demanded through blood relation. And most importantly, the best revenge against people who abandon you is not just surviving without them, but thriving so completely that their absence becomes irrelevant. So, here's my question. For all of you who've made it this far in my story, have you ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life, even when everyone else thought they were perfect? How do you deal with family members who try to take credit for your success while contributing nothing to it? I want to hear your stories in the comments below, because I know I'm not the only one who's had to choose between family peace and personal truth. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that they can survive family abandonment and come out stronger. Subscribe for more stories about standing up to toxic family dynamics and fighting back against people who think they can control your narrative. And remember, you don't owe anyone your silence about their mistreatment, even if they're family. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that sometimes the family that matters most is the one you build for yourself, not the one you're born into. The people who truly love you will support your success, not try to take credit for it while contributing nothing. Trust your instincts, document everything, and never let anyone convince you that their convenience is more important than your truth.